And I say good evening to all of you. This is the second in our series of 4 online meetings around the question of whatever happened to the internet in education, or EdTech. And the second one, our speaker this evening is Jay Horvitz from the Mochved Institute. I've known Jay for 69 years, although I don't know exactly how well, over the years we've had different sorts of contacts, some better, some worse. He's an interesting guy. I wouldn't listen to him until the end, but if you paid for this, I guess why not? And so that being the case, I'm going to invite him to, well, he won't really introduce himself. He's sort of done that already. He'll go into his screen share and find out where it is that he can do, and it's not even ready yet, so I'll have to do that as well. 1 second. Click. And now I have to go back to stop sharing, so I can now go to the screen share. I didn't intend to do it this way. I thought I was ready. Click, and it's not there yet. 1 second. So let's just stop this for a second. I'm going to stop the share. And I'm going to say that I got confused for a moment and somebody else has joined us in the meantime. Leah, wonderful to have you. Let Jay just do some little bit of behind the scenes nonsense that he thought he had taken care of already. And then we'll be ready. Close that. And now we'll open this and bring that back to here and bring it to here. And now we can go to good evening to you all. My name is Jay Horvitz. I'm from the Mochved Institute, and my topic this evening is where is all the Web 2.0 education gone, with a focus also on what happened and why with the learning management system, the LMS. So, as I do this, I want to take, a bit like Martin 3 days ago, a trip in a time machine to go back in time to, well, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity, it was the season of light, it was the season of darkness, it was the spring of hope. Yeah, well, you know, that's Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. I'm not going to go quite far back, but I do want to emphasize that even if it wasn't so far back, it really was good time with times of hope, a spring of hope, when many of us became exposed for the first time to the internet and to the possibilities of the internet in education. I want to quote a little bit here. The power of the internet is in its human connective potential. By connecting us as global citizens and local community members, we learn better. We open ourselves to new ideas and in turn shape the thinking of others through diverse input. We and our students become empowered to apply learning within our societies and in the global communities in ways that can impact powerfully and positively on lives and environment. In short, the internet has the potential for creating an education of hope. That was said in January of 1999 by an interesting person. I don't know if you can see his name there below, Dr. Ed Graggart, who is one of the active people still is apparently in iEarn, an interesting and actually very nice online program, which I had connected with about 20 years ago and forgot about, and it seems to still be going on because these things still exist. But it's very hard to find this article today. I can't find the original I had, but I found a couple of copies on the web. And Web 2.0, though usually we talk about it as coming from 2004, the word itself was coined in 1999 at about that time, when the idea for the web was not only that we can get information, but that it's interactive, that we can get something and give something and give something and get something and build community. And us in education, we said, well, that's what we want. I was elated. I remember when I went to the office of my advisor for my master's thesis, and he showed me Mosaic, and he saw my mouth watering. He saw that this was just something that I said, I was born for this. This is what I want. And well, let's say the honeymoon ended long ago, but the idea was very, very clear to me, and it's something which I really, really viewed as something which I still want. If I would put it in the simplest terms possible, access to information plus interaction and collaboration was able to create a new, improved learning experience. That's what I dreamt of, and many of us dreamt of. And 20 years after that, even more than 20 years after that, we have to start asking ourselves, well, wait a second, is that what we got? So in 2005, we had ClassBlogMeister. We also had Wikispaces. Some of the very first things, I'm sorry, I have to check something out if somebody's trying to get in here because I've gotten a couple of messages. Okay, fine. Somebody was saying she couldn't get in and did get in, so I'm very glad to have her with us. Melody, thank you. And both of these were very, very nice frameworks by which blogging was possible within the classroom. We built wikis which were very nice to use. And we're talking about only 15 years ago. The next year, Will Richardson published his then very, very popular book on blogs, wikis, and podcasts. And other people started getting into the act a little bit later in 2007. And interesting that the book, Making the Most of the Web in the Classroom, is not a good book, I have to promise you. But we were saying, hey, look, everybody can get into this. It's possible. It's very easy. And what I find interesting about this in 2010 is it's Scholastic, which is a very, very mainstream educational company in the States, also tried to get in on the act and did quite a bit to try and tell us how we could use Web 2 in our educational programs. This was really the tip of an iceberg because back in 2010, if we notice here, this is 2013 actually, this particular article told us that EdTech investments had already gone beyond $1 billion. $1 billion is a lot of money. Today, only about 7, 8 years after that, it's now up to something like $5 billion a year. And people see that, wow, educational technology is worth it. If we invest in it, we can really make money. And the tip of this iceberg is simply continued, except that something else happened. What happened? I like to give the example of Vicki Davis. Vicki Davis for me is a metaphor here because Vicki Davis, who was the originator of the Cool Cat Teacher blog, who wrote numerous programs for how to use the internet in the classroom. She, along with Julie Lindsay, built something called the Flat Classroom, the Flat Classroom Project. And it was, for that time, it was great. They not only won awards, as we see in this particular slide, but they also actually did good work, which doesn't always have to do with awards, of course. But then, in 2013, Vicki Davis wrote on her blog that she was giving up on the Flat Classroom Project. She was giving it over to her friend Julie Lindsay because two people couldn't make a living of working through this project. It just wasn't working. And she said, well, I'll let Julie have it and I'll start doing something else. I don't know where Julie is with that at the moment. This is already 7 years ago. But this raises to me a fascinating question. If $1 billion were being invested in EdTech back in 2012, Julie Lindsay and Vicki Davis couldn't find anybody to actually fund for a few $1,000s altogether a wonderful educational project? What happened here? How did that sort of thing happen? In what logical universe couldn't this be done? The answer, of course, to that is in our universe, I'm sorry to say, but I think this is a very major question which has to be dealt with. So not only did something change, what I want to do is try and ask the question of what it is that changed. to do that, I have to explain what I think is an important aspect of the EdTech community, and I put it in quotes, of course. The EdTech community was a coalition made up of some particular groups. It had teachers, educators who were seeking of ways to change their teaching. I was in that group. We saw the possibilities of the web, of the interactive web, and said, wow, this is a way that we can actually make a change in education. It was made up of administrators who said, maybe all of this technology is going to get us better grades in the tests that get to be taken, the standardized tests. And it was, of course, made up from entrepreneurs who said, hey, there's gold in them there hills. I'll get to that in a moment. And they said, well, okay, we're going to build things for these teachers and administrators. And for a few years, this coalition actually worked hand in hand. But did they really have that much in common? The answer is, well, you know what I think the answer is. No, the answer was no. And we saw that administrators were saying, well, blogs and wikis are real nice because, well, it looks like we're really involved in using new tools. And so things are good. We're at the forefront of educational change. But the tools wasn't what interested them. So what is it about tools here? Why should I be focusing on tools in this way? We saw at the same time from the ideas of Web 2.0 to data-centric tools for education. When we were able to test how well students were doing because we were able to collect more and more and more data, people said, Web 2.0 might be nice, but it's not helping on tests. Let's do something else. And the truth is, Web 2.0 tools didn't prove themselves in a particular conception of what education was. If we were to change what education is supposed to be, perhaps it would, but the administrators at least were looking for something in particular and they weren't getting it. And so as tools for collecting and interpreting data improved, the coalition, well, it sort of saw that the teachers, the educators dropped out and the administrators and the entrepreneurs took over. And we became part of a culture of data, which was a culture in the entirety of our society anyway. And as I mentioned, there's gold in our hills. People said, I can make money. Why would I make a couple $1,000s off a project for blogs if I can make hundreds of thousands and millions in other tools which the administrators actually want to buy and implement in their schools? And I think we also have to admit to one more aspect which I hinted at. Even though it wasn't a very well-kept secret, people didn't like to acknowledge it. There were so many tools available. Most of them did the same thing, and there wasn't any effort, really reason to go and keep learning them. So what? Okay, so you can use this instead of that and that instead of this. What exactly do you want to do in the classroom with them? And it also demanded a lot of effort. And there was very little PD, professional development, going on, because instead of doing PD, people said, oh, go off and use the tools, it'll be fine. And so to a certain extent, Web 2.0 shot itself in the foot. And this brings me to what I call a more than slightly depressing interlude. Martin Dougiamas, I'm sure that most of us are familiar with, the originator of Moodle. He is a very interesting, very important person in educational technology and education in general, I think. The slide we see here is from a talk that he gave. I'm very sure it's from a talk that he gave in 2011. It might have been 12 at a Moodle Moot, in which he essentially said, okay, I admit we have a problem. If you look at all the tools that are available in Moodle for interactive learning, why is it that 90% of what gets done in Moodle is providing a passive forum, passive meaning that people wrote but nobody read, especially teachers who I know many of the lecturers I was familiar with didn't understand that opening a forum for their students would also mean that they're supposed to read what their students wrote. It was used for quizzes, and it was used for videos, for articles, and what we used to call spaghetti, just a long list of reading materials which got put on to the page. And he said, I'm sorry, that wasn't what I intended to do, but still 90% of what we built, of what kept used, was these parts and not the more interesting parts that we actually built. So there were so many tools that actually didn't get used. I want to quote now from Lisa Lane. She teaches at Maricopa College in California. It's a community college. Most of her students are working class, and they are often the first persons in their generations to get to a college education. She developed a program at her college called POT, P-O-T. I have listed down Program for Online Teaching. And she said it is a world in which POT now appears, she said this in 2015. She was writing about what essentially distressed her. It's a world in which POT now appears anachronistic, encouraging what I call artisan courses built as creative endeavors by individual instructors trying to translate their teaching strengths into the online environment. These courses are pedagogically and philosophically the opposite of the canned instant feedback, publisher-created packages and team-built classes and MOOCs that are now pervasive. Like artisan breads and handmade cabinetry, these courses require more work to make and are individual in design. Their quality cannot be determined by a list of best practices, but by the love and attention that goes into their creation and the passion and dedication of the teachers who are teaching within their own design. And she continued, we've watched as these artisan principles undermined not only by forces beyond the institution, but by faculty new to online who have been encouraged to think along cookie-cutter course lines. Classes where most of the content comes from a publisher course cartridge and are being held up as models, locally and statewide, as online initiatives are developed to create more standardization and accountability. Faculty now come to POT hoping for how-to workshops. How do I get this to work in Blackboard? Rather than approaching us with pedagogy they want to develop online. The POT CERT class, which is free, global, and at the moment unsustainable, is being used by some to assure training rather than pedagogical preparation. We find ourselves in the position of providing a free service rather than a model, a service which surely should be funded by the state if training is really so important. As you can guess, I usually identify with what Lisa Lane writes. And sadly, she was right. We got to a situation in which one size fits all is good enough, and so why devote so much time to all of this? And remember, all this is from before we had coronavirus. So if we think that something was going to change drastically because of COVID-19, what we see actually happening is something different. People saying, well, how do I get through this? What do I have to do to get the minimum things online so that my students can be doing what they have to be doing? And all this was happening for good and for bad, thanks to the LMS, the Learning Management System. Now, I want to admit from the beginning to a love-hate relationship with the LMS, because it's a tool that made a lot of sense. Martin, we heard 3 days ago. I want to quote from him when he wrote about the VLE, the LMS, in his new book. He made this 2002 on his blog. It was 2004. But there is a balance to be struck between allowing freedom, innovation, and experimentation, and the core functions. It may be a question of time. Education moves slowly, and now that we are at a level of stability with the VLE, more experimentation can happen around the fringes. It's not trendy, but we should give the VLE respect and a little love. Not only do I agree with Martin, but I went into my files, took a little while to find it, but 3 years ago, this guy here also wrote something similar at a Moodle we had in Israel. I wrote then, on the one hand, I understand that today's networks permit more and more self-directed learning that doesn't require an LMS. But on the other, I realize that for many of today's students for whom advanced studies can be strange and frightening, students who are being offered little more than vocational training by today's disrupt everything entrepreneurs, the LMS can be a helpful and necessary crutch toward achieving a real education. And I still think that's true. I think there's a lot of positive things to be said for the LMS, even though to a great extent it closed off what I thought as being the ways in which education could be changed. So why is it that this rather bland LMS survived and even flourished? And I think the answer is very, very simple. At a very basic level, it fit very comfortably into the prevailing pedagogic model. Okay, here are the articles you have to read. I put them up. You can go to them, you can read them, click on them, they'll download for you and be able to see them. This, by the way, was HiLearn, also known as Britannica, and we used it for a few years. I think one of my claims to fame was I was a major hater of Britannica at the time. At some point, they even let us put some graphics into it, but frankly, it didn't help very much. And of course, Blackboard, which allowed a little bit of graphics into all of this, which made it look a little bit more interesting, even though most of the lecturers who I knew who used Blackboard never understood that they could put graphics into their courses. And understandably, Google picked up on this very well. And they said, this is what teachers want. So they built Classroom. And Classroom is pretty much a bare bones, nothing thing where teachers put up materials for their students. Students take it down. Students do assignments and tests, and they can see whether or not they're passing what's happening. It's very, very basic, and people loved Google Classroom. Why? My answer is one I gave just about 2 minutes ago, because Google Classroom essentially understood that most teachers, and obviously almost all schools, didn't really want to change that much. They liked the way things were done, but wanted to integrate the internet into that basic model. Lisa Lane wrote about artisan courses. At that same time, I was calling them designer courses, because myself and another person I was working with at the Akva Academic College, we didn't have an LMS. We were building our own, which was very work intensive. It also cost money, and we couldn't do it for everybody. But each course looked like a special course. If you logged into your courses, you would find your course, which looked different than somebody else's course, because the punishment fit the crime. It was built for the way it was working. And sadly, but also logically, this couldn't maintain itself. You couldn't get 2 people working at a college building courses for 300 lecturers. So Moodle made perfect sense, and Moodle was very nice, but as much as we tried all the time to get our lecturers to actually use Moodle in a more constructive fashion, it didn't really help. What they kept doing was putting up the same, these are the things I want you to read, here you can discuss it, although I won't read it, and at the end of the year we'll have a test. And if that's the way it works, to my mind, maybe we don't need instructional designers at all, even though many universities are now producing more and more of them who supposedly know how to connect between learning and technology. I think one more question has to be asked about this, and that's, are we focusing on learning or are we focusing on management? And as you've guessed, my answer is that the LMS was most loved because it managed. Learning, okay, no problem. You want to put up your lectures, do that. You want to put up reading materials, do that. But make sure that we can find out whether the student passed the course or not, what grade he or she got. These were the important things. And also that the administration would know that the lecturer has actually put up these materials online. So it may be a learning management system, but it emphasized management and sort of only gave a wink toward learning from the side of an eye. But this brings up a real big problem, I'm sorry. Just what are you talking about when you're talking about learning? Because there are obviously very different definitions to that. And I think that's really a question of chicken and egg. Is it the learning that influences how we want to design our education? Or is it the education that determines what could be learned, the educational system that determines how we're going to be presenting it? And that brings us to the question of which pedagogical tradition we actually want to adhere to. I want to quote here on this issue from Ellen Cunliffe-Legman, who is, she was at Harvard back then. She's now at Bard College. She wrote a very fascinating article about 33 years ago, which the part I like quoting is at the very beginning. She says, "One cannot understand the history of education in the United States during the 20th century unless one realizes that Edward L. Thorndike won and John Dewey lost." Now, everybody knows who Dewey is. Few people know about Thorndike. And Thorndike was a contemporary of Dewey. He was definitely a progressive educator, but his idea of progressive education was a respectable one. He wanted education for all, but he was very, shall we say, Turnerist in the sense that he wanted to streamline education that would be effective. And today, it's true. Thorndike's conception won out over Dewey's, even though many of us still identify with Dewey. I know I do, and most of the people whom I work with do as well. I want to quote from Richard A. Giboney, who is at the University of Pennsylvania, who, I don't know if he's that right about it. Giboney is about in his 90s, and he said this only a few years ago, so we can allow him to be a little bit exaggerated. To put the distinction sharply, Thorndike saw humans in the image of the machine. Dewey saw them in the image of life. And we've been essentially paying the price since. Which brings me to one more very, very short interlude. I always quote Alan Kay, one of the developers of the laptop and of other things within EdTech and technology in general, digital things in general. Technology is anything that wasn't around when you were born. This is an important sentence, and it's important for us to realize that technologies have been around with us for a very, very long time. William A. Alcott, who was related, he was a distant uncle, I think, of Louisa May, in 1843, published a book called Slate and Blackboard Exercises. It's a fascinating book. I've read the entire thing, by the way. It's available. You can find it via Google Books, I think, in which he takes a new technology and says, we can use this in the classroom effectively with students. But if we do, we have to do it in certain ways which are different than the ways which we have done before when we didn't have the blackboard in the classroom. It's a great book. I wouldn't use it as how to teach me how to be a teacher today. But the questions he deals with and the way he deals with them are very, very interesting. And this is technology, which was part of how people learned. The next technology in EdTech, which is very, very usually referred to, was Pressey's testing machine. And Pressey did a wonderful job. He himself, I'll quote him here, "Teaching machines are unique among instructional aids in that the student not merely passively listens, watches, or reads, but actively responds. And as he does so, he finds out whether his response is correct or not. And a record may be kept which aids in improving the materials." Let's understand that there's nothing wrong with that. It may sound terribly Skinneristic, which of course it is, and I'll even say some good things about Skinner if I have time for it as we go on, because there's something positive to be said about the ability to actually test and to see if someone learned what we wanted them to learn. But this testing machine was a testing machine. The interaction was there, but the interaction was still very, very one way. And this brings us clearly to conflicting approaches of technology in education. On the left, we have B.F. Skinner. On the right, we have Seymour Papert. And Papert obviously attempted to do something totally different than what Skinner wanted with his technology. And still, even though lip service to Papert is paid every day, it's unclear that this is really what the educational system wants. And if I've quoted here, I may as well put it, Skinner saw things as being externally determined, an externally determined body of knowledge which we had to transmit to the students, whereas Papert saw the learner constructing his or her own path to knowledge and focusing on what he or she wanted to learn. Actually, I should have said this differently. Maybe knowing about educational theory and the history of education can hurt, because once the educational entrepreneurs know something about what really happened in education over the last 150 years, they begin perhaps to realize that their ideas aren't quite so great and aren't quite so original. This brings me to what is known as the Audrey test. I don't think that Audrey Waters has used this in a number of years already, but I learned it from her and have used it a number of times with some groups that I've worked with. Her test is very simple. She says, okay, if I present these three people to educators, all of the educators will be able to tell me their names. We know that this is Mark Zuckerberg, this is, see, I've even forgotten, Steve Jobs, and this is Bill Gates. All educators will know these names without any problem. If, however, I present these 5 educators to EdTech entrepreneurs, the chances that they're going to be able to recognize who these people are close to nil. We have, I'll go around from the corner here to the clock. I think all of you will be able to do this by yourselves, but we have John Dewey, Lev Vygotsky, B.F. Skinner, I already mentioned Seymour Papert, and Paulo Freire. And we could show others. We could show other people who are important in the idea of EdTech, of educational theory and history. And most EdTech entrepreneurs would never have even have heard the names and weren't even interested in them because they were sure that they were able to invent education without having to know something about what went before. By the way, I want to say something else about technology here, because educational technology is not only digital tools. How different, I'll still be with digital for a moment. How different is Skinner's box to a Amplify tablet? To my mind, very little. We'll get to that as we go on in a moment. Or if I were to give this classroom here from 1915 iPads, would there really be something that different in the way the students were learning? My personal answer to that is no. I know people who tell me differently, but after all, I'm the person giving the lecture tonight, so, you know, gotta follow me for a little while still, a few more minutes. And as I say, a significant part of the answer is that it depends on the pedagogical approach and the educational goals that you want. And more often than not, the educational goals, which then determine the pedagogical approach, is one which is far from being revolutionary and actually is very, very standard and hasn't changed, even though people tell us education hasn't changed. What hasn't changed is the way many of the entrepreneurs think that what education should be doing. Very simply, most of education today doesn't want to be constructivist. Instead, we have more and more and more and more data, which is able to give us a picture of whether or not the student is learning or not. And this also means that we're always seeing what's happening. We're keeping a good eye on our students. We know what's going on, and we don't let them out of our sight. Andrew Ng, who was one of the founders of Coursera, said back then at the beginning of Coursera, the data we are collecting is unprecedented in education. We see every mouse click and keystroke. We know if a user clicks one answer and then selects another or fast forwards through part of a video. It's unclear whether the laundry list of refinements that result from A/B testing will add up to a grand theory of learning and teaching that challenges tradition. I read Piaget and Montessori, and they both seem compelling, but educators generally have no way to choose what really works. Today, education is an anecdotal science, but I think we can turn education into a data-driven science where you do what you know works. Educators, at least educators that I know who read this, say, and I always thought that education was an art. But the people who are furthering most of what's being done in digitality in education today apparently see it as a science. Joel Klein was the commissioner of schools in New York City for a number of years. Then he joined with News Corps and was the head of the Amplify project. We see the Amplify on the right. And in the advertisement for Amplify, we read, the teacher has the ability to monitor everything happening on the rest of the tablets in the classroom. So if you thought at one point that the tablet was a personal tool, think again. The tablet was actually something which allowed a different sort of control over what happened within the classroom. Jose Ferreira is no longer with Newton. Newton actually, I think, went out of business, if I remember correctly, a year ago, but I could be wrong. But he built Newton from the ground up. Has a new project which he hasn't yet told us exactly what it is. But I love a couple of quotes of his from way back. If you learn concept number 513 best in the morning between 8:20 and 9:35 with 80% text and 20% rich media, and no more than 32 minutes at a time, well, then the odds are you're going to learn every one of 12 highly correlated concepts best at that time. Now that may seem a terrible exaggeration, but it isn't, because the next quote is much more. We're really excited to correlate with other people's data sets by open API things like something we've talked about as a kind of a joke, but it really should work, is like the food dialogue. You tell us what you had for breakfast every morning at the beginning of the semester. By the end of the semester, we should be able to tell you what you had for breakfast because you always do better on the days you had scrambled eggs or whatever. And more importantly, we should be able to tell you what you should have for breakfast. Well, I suppose you can understand why Newton went out of business, because what can I say? Hubris of this sort just doesn't cut it. I'm sorry. But here I said I would get away from digitality for a moment because it can be it comes in other sizes. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Steelcase Node chair, which sells for about $160. You can see students sitting on them there. Each one of those is $160. You can imagine what it's going to be for a school to buy them. And please note that in their advertisement, they say this is the chair that started a classroom revolution. Believe it or not, that chair made it possible for students to get together in small groups within the classroom and then divide into different groups, because before then they couldn't do it. Well, I guess before then they could do it with regular chairs. They could even go outside and sit on the grass, which some of us did 20, 30 years ago. But this chair started a revolution because when you get to EdTech hubris, there's no end to it. And if we have a couple of minutes, I'm checking the time at the moment, and we do because I'm getting relatively close to ending. I want to show a little video from a EdTech company. I don't know if they still exist, but it's only from 2.5 years ago, from a French company, which I hope that you have I hope it'll come in well for you now. It's about 2 minutes long. And
Jay, we don't hear any voice.
You don't hear voice?
No.
Okay. It'll be over in a minute, and it's also the text down below, so it's okay. This is only the lecturer talking. They're telling us about the first artificial intelligence class. Facial detection, signs of inattention are detected.
Incredible.
Students are more attentive. Wonderful. Fewer physical classrooms. Okay. Personalized coach for thousands of students, although nobody understands what that means. Machine learning can use data from social networks, and it can register missing students from class, which actually has nothing to do with that. Now, why do I show that rather than beyond the reason that I wanted to drink a little bit of my tea and rest my voice for a moment? I did that basically because this is where people think they're going to make money in ed tech today. And it is definitely not what 20 years ago, those of us who got into this field thought was going to be where this was going to be leading. And we can always find new excuses. When Web 2.0 didn't pan out as hoped, Larry Kuban, the tech industry still looked for a good argument. How are we going to continue to promote ourselves? And so Larry Kuban, a well-respected researcher in technologies in education and the history of education in general, he told us that the best and most recent gift to the hardware and software industry has been the Common Core standards and assessments. At a time of fiscal retrenchment in school districts across the country, when schools are being closed and teachers are let go, many districts have found the funds to go on shopping sprees to get ready for the Common Core. And here's the point I want to make. The old reasons for buying technology have been shunted aside for a sparkling new one. In other words, the objective isn't better learning. The objective isn't necessarily how to make schools better. The objective is to get these things into the hands of people who are going to buy them, because that's the way EdTech is going to continue to promote itself. And as I say, I've gotten close to the end, very close, but I still want to do some quoting. I like quoting people who are important because, it makes me seem as though I know what I'm talking about. The teaching machine's mindset definitely continues into the digital age. I want to quote from Aldous Huxley in his final, in the preface to the final edition of Brave New World. In an age of advanced technology, inefficiency is a sin against the Holy Ghost. This same idea is expressed very, very well by Evgeny Morozov in his book called To Save Everything, Click Here. Morozov is a fascinating person to read. I don't know how he learned the languages he's learned. He's brighter than I am, that's for sure. He writes, the urgency of the problems in question does not automatically confer legitimacy upon a panoply of new, clean, and efficient technological solutions so in vogue these days. And he's not only talking about education, he's talking about everything that the technologies want to try and make better. He adds, attaining technological perfection without attending to the intricacies of the human condition and accounting for the complex world of practices and traditions might not be worth the price. And he says might not, obviously, in a way which suggests that he knows it's not worth the price. But when we see about the complexities, I think we understand that education is obviously one of these areas where these complexities are an important part. Nicholas Carr, whom I'm sure that many of us are familiar with, says something similar when he writes about the then head of Google, Sundar Pichai. He says, with this offhand example, Pichai gives voice to Silicon Valley's reigning assumption, which can be boiled down to this: anything that can be automated should be automated. If it's possible to program a computer to do something a person can do, then the computer should do it. That way the person will be freed up to do something more valuable. Just what more valuable is, well, that's an entirely different question. And I want to take those thoughts of Huxley and Morozov and Carr into the educational field and do a little bit of quoting as well. Deborah Britzman, who's now at York University in Toronto, wrote a few years ago, the practice of teaching, because it is concocted from relations with others and occurs in structures that are not of one's own making, is first and foremost an uncertain experience that one must learn to interpret and make significant. In other words, what, do I have to interpret this for you? No, I don't have to. It's very clear. We're not talking about this is what I'm passing on to you. We're talking about how it is that we're interacting in order for us to create knowledge. And Gert Biesta, one of the most interesting to my mind educational theoreticians today. He's a Dutch theoretician who is presently in, I wrote it down because he's moved a couple of times. Now he's in Edinburgh, but also working in a university in Ireland. I want to quote from one of his books as well. In this respect, it is also clear that educational institutions and individual educators should indeed respond to the needs of the learners. To think of students as learners and of learners as customers can be a helpful way of achieving precisely this. What he's referring to now is that the EdTech conception is that we have someone who is a consumer, he's a customer, and we're giving him something. And so we have to fit what we want to give, what he actually wants to consume. We have to be able to set it in a precise and effective way. And Biesta then goes on, but the more fundamental question is whether the educational process itself can be understood and should be understood in economic terms. That is, as a situation in which the learner has certain needs and where it is the business of the educator to meet these needs. Clearly, what Biesta says, and he says it throughout his book, no, this is not it. Because if we are educators, we have a conception of where our students are, what we think is good and is worth moving toward, and therefore we don't only answer to their self-determined needs, but we also want to create in them needs and desires which we can then further and make more worthwhile in education. And that brings me to my very, very final thoughts with you at the moment, because that's not from the Beatles. Actually, it is from the Beatles, but okay, you know, I'm allowed to do that. 20 years ago, in print, it was in Hebrew, but it's in print, so I can prove that I said it. I was very, very hopeful about the positive effect of digital technology in education. What I wrote was that the internet was going to force education to question itself and to actually make itself change in ways which are going to be in a constructivist direction. I thought that 20 years ago. As I say, it's in print. And I've discovered time and again that the chances of that actually happening have become fewer and fewer, but I sort of still am hopeful. I really think that there's something about these tools which means that we can do something to make education what many of us really think it should be, even if what happened to EdTech is, sadly to my mind, almost the opposite. So I can stop screen sharing and I can say thank you for listening, because I didn't give you microphones so you only could listen. You've been unmuted, and now I can see who is here. I'm very glad to see that there are 12 of us here. And I hope that this was interesting to you, and I intend to open this up for discussion.
Okay.
Yeah, very well.
Hi, this is Sherman. Hi, Jay. So I think if I summarize what you're saying is basically that educational technology sort of went, instead of going down the road to Dewey, it went down the road to Thorndike, and pretty much things have been developed in that direction, and with Google and automation and so forth. So my question is this because of educational technology, or is this because of broader issues such as looking at education as a way of creating workers in the future, the way that governments and states determine what education is? In other words, to what extent really do teachers have a say in this, or educational technologists for that matter? In other words, aren't there broader issues at play?
Not only are there, I think 3 days ago with Martin, we actually touched on some of those as well. You're obviously correct. I would put it in a slightly different way, though. I would add something from a slightly different perspective. At what point did you and Melody come in this evening? because at relatively early, one of the things I referred to was what I call the coalition of educators, administrators, and edtech entrepreneurs. And what I said was that 20 years ago, we had essentially a real coalition where these three were working together. By the way, what I didn't mention there is that the students were not part of that coalition, because who really cared? Ruthie, Ruthie, can you mute yourself there? Yes, okay, I've mute Ruthie. The students were not a part of that. They are always the product of education. And what you're saying is the product of education is something which is determined by business, by government, and I can't argue with you because you're right. What I think happened here in terms of the question that you asked is that the possible positive directions that EdTech was able to push toward and to nudge toward got nudged out. And so then essentially I see myself as a loser here. I also see students as the losers, but that's a different problem there. I see in terms of that coalition, nobody needs the teachers to determine how EdTech is going to be used. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's distinctly I agree with you on what you said. Next.
Jay, firstly, thank you very much. That was, if I can say to you, I've been thinking a lot about EdTech very much along these kind of cookie cutter lines. And this was very eye-opening to me in particular to get me to change direction. If I could ask you to imagine an alternate timeline in which you won, what would digital education look like?
Okay, it's interesting. One of the classic phrases in my school of EdTech was read Mindstorms. Mindstorms was the classic book by Seymour Papert, and frankly, Mindstorms wasn't internet intensive. Quite the opposite. Mindstorms was based on kids using the turtle in Logo and building for themselves. And the idea that kids would then construct for themselves how they understood the world and would learn through that was not only a correct assumption, or one that I would still identify with, but I think that the introduction of the internet both helped and hindered that Mindstorms direction. You have today things like what came instead of Logo. Somebody remind me. Sherman?
I don't.
It'll come to me. Which also has an online base for it, an online community, but at some point we started to see the positive aspect of EdTech being access to information, which is true, which is good, which is important, but the building part, the constructing part, got pushed aside. And I hope that this is what Rob and Paul will be talking about, how they think that it's still possible to further that part with the internet Scratch. Thank you very much, Leah. Yes, I was talking about Scratch and it got away from me. I had an S on my tongue, but it didn't come out. And had things gone differently, I think the problem with the question that you asked me for me is, well, the world would be different. And because I can't really say that the world could be different, I don't know to answer that it could have made the difference it did. Still, I think we would have moved farther away from standardized tests, which may be happening now simply because we can't give them in a fair fashion, not because people are against them, but because they think that it's problematic today. So if we want to say good things about coronavirus, then maybe that's that. So moving away from standardized tests could be one of the directions, but I think that you would still have a standard educational system, because in loco parentis was not going to be changed. Vast amounts of home teaching were not going to happen, even though you could get this at home. You would still have some people who would be the membrane through which certain things were allowed into the classroom, certain things weren't allowed in. And by the way, in that sense, I think there's something true or positive about an educational system, which is, what would be the word here? Artificial. I like the idea of artificiality in the sense that not everything comes in one fell swoop, but is balanced for what might be what each person is capable of learning at that particular time. Because I don't think that everyone is today in a position to be a individually generated learner. I know what I want to learn, I'm going out and learn it. If that were true, as an economist whom I knew from some 50 years ago used to say, if you needed perfect people to have a revolution, you wouldn't need a revolution. And the same thing is true if you needed self-directed learners to have good education, you wouldn't need an educational system. So in that sense, I think that we really do have to be inching toward, slouching toward, even to use a Joan Didion phrase, toward a more open educational system, but we're still not going to have the vast majority of students being self-motivated. And for that reason, I have a hard time answering your question, but I think I did. I got to what you were asking about. Wendy?
As you're saying that, I don't know, are you familiar with the education in Finland, where I watched a very good documentary by an American, actually, Dr. Wagner, where he compared one of the American states with Finland. They were comparable in ethnicity and the number of people. But in Finland, the students from primary school way up to high school are using high-tech and low-tech together and working on projects and are self-motivated and I would have packed my bags and gone tomorrow if I were 20 years younger. It was just exhilarating watching it. So it was standard in one respect, but there was room for students to do their own thing. You could sit with your pen and pencil and have your laptop, and it was just phenomenal. It really was. But I can't ever see that happening in Turkey, and even in the UK, there's a lot of resistance, you know. I mean, Turkey, it's all test orientated, and the government controls the curriculum with an iron hand. And many people like that. That's what they want. You know, if you're trying to do something different, they get upset. They want to do their test, put the number at the end.
I think that we also have to ask another question, which is for, I think all of us have seen, or many of us have seen the films about the Finnish school system. I think that we've seen the very, very nice parts, and we haven't been shown some of the less successful. Although yes, I have to say, I'm very happy to know that they're not doing as well on the TIMSS and PISA tests as we used to be. Yes. I think that's a wonderful thing to say about Finland, which doesn't get said enough. In other words, they went in the direction which wasn't good for TIMSS and PISA, and they didn't say, oh, we're doing the wrong thing. So that's a very good thing. But I think we also have to understand one of the aspects of Finnish education is that Finnish society is a very, very homogeneous society.
Yes. Yes,
and that is there's something very positive about that for the educational system, and also makes it very difficult to read from that into other societies which are not like that. But as I think I mentioned, or somebody else mentioned in our meeting with Martin, one of the things that schools does is that it gives hot meals to children.
Yes, it does.
In the United
It
States and in other places. And I think that here we have to say something else. And I think I'll move away from EdTech for a moment when I'll say that at least in the States, the idea of education is going to change society, because people through education will be able to advance their station, has been a myth for the past 50 years, but it's a very strong myth. And it's a myth that places a great deal of what would be the right word here? It demands a great deal from teachers, which teachers cannot meet, because the school is not going to be the place that's going to make the change in society. If society can change itself, schools will also change. And certainly there is a symbiosis here. But
I mean, I've not ever taught in America, and from what I've seen and heard, I go, oh my goodness, getting top marks and winning. I was at a conference years ago in America, and somebody saw my face when they were talking about competition, and I must have had a look of disapproval on my face, because I was thinking about learning and they were thinking about being top of the class. But is it true that it's more a case of containment in some schools in America due to the culture of wherever it is, whether it's urban or rural, or what the ethnic mix is and so on, rather than education?
I apologize. I've been living in Israel for the past 49 years now. Right. And I don't know what happens in education in the States other than what I read. And frankly, I read the people I want to agree with more of the time than I read the people I don't want to agree with. So it's a little bit unfair for me to reach conclusions here.
Right. I understand.
Yes.
Where is the person from America, though? Somebody there is from America.
Yes, we have a couple. We have a few of them here. We have Alice, we have Rob, and we have Paul. Do you have things you can tell us about that? Alice, we'll be hearing Rob and Paul, for a full hour and a half in another week. So if you have something to tell us about this, we'd like to know.
Well, I am not a teacher, so I cannot speak from any point of personal experience, except as a former student and a current student. I'm currently pursuing my doctorate in education, so I'm learning a lot, but I have no expertise with which to address
in the classroom, which is different, of course. Yes.
I mean, I feel like I can speak to it to some degree. I'm not currently an in-classroom teacher full time, but I was a classroom teacher for 18 years. In my experience in U.S. education, it's interesting, Wendy, that you mentioned, is this an idea of containment, or is it? From my experience, most teachers that I have worked with are really hamstrung by a system that has in many ways. On one hand, we talk in the United States about democracy all the time. But if you look at almost every institution that is an American institution, they're not. If you look at corporations, they're not democratic. If you look at the classroom, it's not democratic. Very few institutions are democratic. So kind of subconsciously, there is this feeling teachers wanting to do the right thing. And there's a structure in the classroom that doesn't allow them to do that. And a lot of that, from my experience, has to do with 20 or 30 years of pushing testing onto teachers and requiring all these kind of tests. That's been a real depressant for many teachers. When it started really coming into play in the 90s, when I started teaching, many teachers that I knew got more and more depressed as teachers because they could do less and less creative work. And so the way I look at it at this point, the technology companies have jumped in and just, they see money, and they've in some ways colluded with the different districts to sell them products that they need to put large amounts of money into. For me, a clear example is like smart boards.
Oh yes, we have this problem in Turkey.
Yeah. So, and when smart boards
it takes
started
over the
coming
classroom.
around, well, and they're expensive, and there's no training. And at some point when smart boards started, I remember reading an article that said in England, 80% of the classrooms had smart boards, and 20% of the classrooms actually used them. And there's just, years and years of watching all these big purchases by districts because they felt like they needed to do that. And again, it comes back to not really supporting the teachers, but, we have all this money, we got to spend it. What I appreciate about...
Sorry, here in Turkey, they have the same problem that they buy smart boards. I think there's a smart board in every school now in Turkey that the government put in because they want to look Western and modern for all the parents, whether it's a state school or a fee-paying school. And it's not working well. And also our technology in Turkey is pretty varied. So you might have electricity one day in one district and no electricity the next day. There are all sorts of problems like this. So it defeats the purpose.
Yeah. I appreciated, Jay having a picture of Paulo Freire as a, important thinker. When I went through grad school, reading about his work and really seeing myself as an educator, as a revolutionary, but also as a political actor, has been really a driving force for me. And even being in schools where I felt like, I was being controlled by whatever systems above me, I've always felt that what we need to do as educators is continue to see ourselves as political actors inside for children. So I do whatever I can to push against all of those things. Even when I'm mandated to do things, when I first started teaching, I was mandated to use a textbook 52% of the time, and I just didn't. I didn't do it, and I pushed against the administration. And what I really did is I built allegiances with the families, and I said, "Do you want your kids to be happy at school, or do you want your kids to be bored and miserable?" And by building allegiances with the families, then they could be allies in pushing against the school with me. And I think that's a really important thing when we think about a lot of the ed tech things is, are they helping kids or not? And that's always a question I think we need to ask, and ask administrators.
We lost you for a second, Rob. Okay. We've lost Rob, so if someone wants to jump in.
I will.
Well, I think as a parent of former students, I think what Rob was alluding to is exactly the problem, is that there needs to be a societal change, and there needs to be some kind of disruption as families in the social structure view school as the place where, kids aren't going to school now, where are they going to get their lunch? It's less about education.
Right.
It's more about the containment and the, parents have to go to work, so what are you going to do with your kids? And it's been turned around, and I think it's all about compliance and teaching to the test and having the metrics to support, this is the curriculum we're using and look how well we're performing. But the core learning and providing an education is what's getting lost in all of the noise. And until many families, this is anecdotal, but I can get back to you next week or next Monday
Very good.
with empirical data that families are completely disengaged in a great many districts. And it's that reinforcement, as Rob was saying, is you need to make the alliance with the families, because 3 o'clock or whatever time the dismissal bell rings, that learning isn't going to stop them. So it needs to be a continuum. And the more that the family structure is supporting the educational structure, cue the angel chorus. But the dropping the kids off and explaining, educate my kid, is not working. And that's, I think, the model that we keep perpetuating. And, I keep waiting for the year-round schooling. We're not an agricultural society anymore. We don't need the kids to run the combine in the summer. So, why don't we stop taking a break for 3 months and having kids forget everything they learned in the spring quarter by the time they get back in school in the summer, in September. There are a lot of issues that no one seems brave enough to stand up and start picking away at.
I want to jump in here for a second from a slightly different perspective. When I was a classroom teacher, which is a long time ago, I pretty much built all of my own things, and I frankly burned out because of that. We have with us this evening, for instance, both Osnat and Sherman, who built programs for classrooms. Sherman, that's correct. Yeah, that's fair. Okay, actually, around sciences and technology. And I think that it's important to understand that some very good people are actually building good things which could be used by teachers. It's not as though everything that the school system forces on to teachers is something which isn't what they want to use, or isn't good for being used, or isn't worthwhile in the classroom. There are actually some very, very good materials. I know because I've seen these. I've worked with these people and I know what I'm talking about. But when it gets fit into the entirety of the educational system, that's when things start to be problematic. And I think that it would be wrong to expect all teachers to be do-it-yourselfers. Some really can't, and even those who can, it's pretty much a good recipe for quick burnout. So I think there's something very good to be said about the fact that there are groups and individuals who are building worthwhile educational programs to be used in the schools. However, go ahead.
I would just add, I think more important than having good educational programs is having good principals that can spearhead the development of good culture in the school. And I think that Rob is an example of a hero teacher, and that's great. But I think that if you want to really scale up, you need to have hero principals, and principals who can gather people like Rob and other people together and develop cultures that support those kinds of programs. Because I can tell you tons of programs that are really excellent, but they're just not used. And it pains me to see good materials. In the case of our granddaughter, who is taking biology, a passion of mine, and I see materials that are available that the teacher just doesn't use. She's using the book, but she's not using the simulations.
It's signal versus noise. You can't separate the good stuff.
Now what's happening there, there's no educational leadership in the school. And so the teachers basically get to determine what to do and not. Anyway. I think that
there is educational leadership in the school, and part of the problem then is, as you described it, Sherman, is the ability to scale up. So again, using America, the country with which I'm most familiar and spent 39 years working in various schools, a school district led by a superintendent, a well-meaning educator, has to sell his entire constituency that all of the schools are good, or all of the schools are equal. And the problem, of course, is that we all know not every school is equal, because In some schools, we have Robs as teachers. In other schools, we don't. In some schools, we have principals who want to follow what the superintendent is saying. And in other schools, we have principals who want to tread down a different path. And yet, in the community, the belief is always, well, it's our schools. And so you have essentially the tension between the individual teacher in the classroom. And there's no question, I've worked with Rob, he's an outstanding teacher. But you have the tension between the outstanding teacher, the outstanding principal, and then the district leadership, which has to sell the concept that every school is that good, even if they're not.
Why? For money?
In the United States, yes, because school districts tend to be funded locally. And so you need all of the voters of the school district to show up to pass whatever the budget is that you want.
Oh, that's a nightmare.
Property taxes go to fund local education systems. So you have, really expensive houses and really good schools, and the reverse.
And the reverse. You see, in the UK, Scotland has its own, today it has its own parliament, but before that it was always responsible for its own education and own legal system within the UK system. And until maybe the last 10 years, the Scottish education was far superior to that in England, because in Scotland it was more egalitarian. And so the funding was more egalitarian as well. And if you lived in centre of Edinburgh, it must have been very difficult for the teachers, I thought, because the pupils all came from very, very middle-class families who had fathers who were professors or doctors, and they knew a lot. So they would challenge their teachers in many ways as to whether that was correct or not. So they had a different difficulty in those schools. But we don't have that sort of problem at all. You can opt to go to a fee-paying school, but not so many people do, I think.
I'd like to call attention, thank you, Wendy. I'd like to call attention to things that Sam has been writing in the chat. I don't know if everybody has seen it. It's very interesting. I'd like to read it because I also want to not respond, but to build on that. As I'm listening, I want to push back a little for the cookie cutter model. Speaking from South Africa, where we have in many government schools some of the worst education in the world, unfortunately, with, of course, massive societal issues, but also problems of completely untrained, unqualified, and often even unmotivated teachers. The idea of a robo-teacher who actually knows the material is always on time and available at scale is very tempting. I wish all teachers were like Rob, but what about a lack of accountability for poor teachers in the system without comprehensive measurements? I won't belittle that. I really will not belittle that. I think that's it's an important point. But I also know, and as I say but without, I don't mean it as contradictory. Liberia a couple of years ago had a very interesting problem. They had a EdTech group from the States who came in and said, we will take over educational system. We will do everything for you. I don't remember their name at the moment, but I've written about it so I can find it if I have to. And we will use digital tools for that. And we'll take care of what you need to teach your students. And Liberia went for that for a little while until they said, but this isn't working for a number of different reasons. One of the reasons was because they didn't have good teachers for that either. They were real robo teachers. In other words, they were using the book. They were going, okay, 5 minutes on this, 5 minutes on this, and we'll do something else and that. But also because there was a true cultural disparity, where you had someone coming in and saying, I know what's good for you. And I take from that, I would also go for the interesting problem of what one laptop per child encountered. One laptop per child seemed like a very wonderful idea. It made sense. And yet it still had a, pardon the word, imperialistic conception, which was that if we can only get these tools into the hands of kids, they'll be able to take care of it by overcoming their teachers and the framework that they grew up in. And that doesn't work. It doesn't work. But this brings me to one other point, which I think, even though we're getting very close to ending time, so I don't mind shutting down in a moment. But one other point I think is very, very interesting, which occurred to me as we've been having this 20-minute discussion here, which is that my presentation ostensibly dealt with EdTech in education, digital and technological tools in education, but actually very quickly we moved away from digital tools and the question of how were they best integrated into the learning process to deal with questions which frankly are more important. What is learning? How is learning supposed to be expressed within a society? Does learning actually further changes in society, or does it strengthen the, pardon the words, I use these words too frequently, status quo? And so when we moved away from EdTech to these questions of the place of education and educational systems within society, we started talking about something which is much broader and, to my mind, even more important. But I think that we got to that because we started talking about the questions of digitality in education and how, from being originally seen as a revolutionary movement, actually became one which was very reinforcing of the existing conditions. And I think that, at least for me, one of the things that I understood from that was how education really, how the tools are not what determines things. I would say to Rob here that I was familiar with Paulo Freire well before I had my first computer. And yet still, I think knowing Freire before the computer made me realize something about what the computer did or was able to do. And then, so as at first my excitement and my interest in using these tools was to move in a particular direction. And then my disappointment grew out of the fact that I saw that not only did this not happen, but that there were too many forces acting against this actually being able to be successful. We're about ready to sum up tonight. In next Monday, Ruti, who I put on mute because her family was making too much noise for us to talk.
I'm sorry about that.
No, we don't mind. It was very nice to hear them. She will be presenting, and I think that she will be presenting also from a more or less positive perspective, taking something like the MOOC, which is something which I've been very, very critical of, not because I don't love the idea, but because I've become disappointed with it. I think Ruti will show us how it can still be a positive thing. And then we're going to hopefully end on a very positive note on Thursday with Paul and Rob telling us about how it is possible to take digital tools and do positive learning. So I'm hopeful for that. And unless somebody wants to say something now, we're going to sign off. I'll finish my tea. I'll make the recording available to you. The recording won't be available until Sunday because the Moffatt Institute is closed tomorrow, but it'll be ready, and I promise you'll be able to get it, and I hope it'll be interesting for a second time through.
Quick question, Jay. Is the recording from last session available too?
It wasn't sent to you? Yes, it is. I'll send it. I'll send the link. I'll send the link.
Thank you. Thanks to me also, please, if that's possible.
You didn't get it? I'll check what happened. Okay. Did other people receive it?
No,
No.
none of us.
Oh, okay. I was told that it got sent out. I'm sorry. Okay. I will see to it. On Sunday, I'll put out both of these to everybody, and we'll be sure that you are able to get it. Very good. So thank you very much for this evening. Looking forward to seeing you next week, and I hope things were interesting.
Very nice.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Good night. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night to you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.